Hi, folks. Yes, I am here. I am here. How are you? Dolores says, hi, all. Kay says, hi, all. Glad to see you. Steve Wolfbrand says, hi, all. And hello, Kay. And Kay says, hi, Steve. And Stephen Day says, are we madder than hell now, team? We sure are. And Rebecca says, hello, everyone. Kay says, watching a People's Party on YouTube. Thomas Frank is on. Love him. Yeah, I was watching that just a couple of minutes ago also. Glad he's looking in on the People's Party. Steve Wolfbrand says, just got a call from my boss 5 minutes ago. His adult daughter, a mental health therapist at a jail, has tested positive. She still lives at home. I'm a bit nervous. We'll try to test tomorrow. Steve Wolfbrand says, Thomas Frank is the best. No, he's not. Anyway, he's pretty good. I like Thomas Frank, but he's far from the best. Kay says, yes, he is. Steve Wolfbrand says, getting there. Steve Day says, ranked choice voting to eliminate damned aisle in Congress. And Rebecca says, hello, Joe. Claudette says, hello, Claudette. How are you? And welcome. Kay says, hi, Joe and Bonnie. And Rebecca says, I started the Economic and Monetary Policy Circle at MPP. Would love to have you advise, Joe. I'll be happy to advise the MPP. Anytime you'd like me to appear on a Zoom call, just give me enough notice so that I can make things consistent with the programming here. Joe, I don't know if, I'm not sure whether you pronounce your name Gomes or Gomez, Joe, but hi, it's good to see you. So you will let me know how you pronounce your name, and I will get it right. I will get it correct. I hope. Okay, so the topic for tonight is austerity maybe coming our way again. Big fight over austerity, paying the price for Bernie not taking the 2015 campaign, the 2020 campaign as opportunities to educate against austerity policies, still finding austerity framings and austerity memes everywhere. Of course, the latest thing that's happening is with regard to the survival checks bill, also called the stimulus bill, also known as the relief package. There, of course, that started with people from the Problem Solvers Caucus. I'd really call them the Problem Causing Caucus. Anyway, the Problem Causing Caucus came together and decided through some magical means that they could put together a bill that would would involve a total of $908 billion in spending, and that spending, furthermore, would only include $188 billion in new money, with the rest being repurposed money from the CARES Act. So money was taken from the CARES Act and now is being used to do things, at least some of those are good things, like the unemployment checks and also the survival checks, which now look like they're going to be going to people. But we're not exactly sure what the bill, is going to look like yet. We're pretty sure. You're also pretty sure it's going to be tacked on as a rider to the government funding bill. So they're going to do both at once. It's going to be a total of roughly $900 billion or $908 billion. Looks like there will be checks for individuals $600 per individual. Earlier today, it looked like it might be $700 for adults, $600 for children. Looks now like it's going to be $600, okay, for everybody. So this, of course, is not as much as was put out in the CARES Act, but it is something. We wouldn't be getting any direct payments at all, except for the objections that were lodged by Bernie Sanders and the Republican Senator Josh Hawley, the senator from Missouri. He is a supporter, it turns out, of survival checks. He and Bernie agreed that the survival check should be at least $1,200. And of course, since the funding for the total package was arbitrarily set at $908 billion, there's not enough there's not enough money in the $908 billion to do $1,200 a person and give people the unemployment checks too. So naturally, there has to be a cutting, because they set a top line magical number. They can't possibly go over that number, because that would be fiscally irresponsible. Mitt Romney magically decided that would be fiscally irresponsible. And Mark Warner agrees with him, and Joe Manchin agrees with him. And they don't like the fact that Bernie wants his $1,200. Of course, in the beginning, they didn't like the fact that Bernie wanted any stimulus. But then I guess they must have gotten calls or telegrams or letters or various communications from people in their states, and they realized that people want checks. More than 80% of the people want checks. 82% or something like that. Polling shows checks are very, very popular. So they figured, well, we better give them some checks, but we can't give them too much or they're going to get uppity. That would create a problem. So, and then Mitch got into the act, and Mitch said to his people, Kelly and David are getting hammered in Georgia. I don't know how he figured that one out, because the Democrats keep sending new emails saying that Kelly and David are ahead of the two Democrats in Georgia, and we got to send them money. We got to send them money quick. Now, each of them has raised $50 million for their campaigns for the Senate in what is not a particularly large state. It's kind of a medium-sized state with regard to population, maybe 16 electoral votes in that state. So it's far from the largest state, but $50 million is not enough for them to get their message out in that state, evidently. We got to send more and more and more, because huge amounts of money are being poured in from Wall Street to save the Senate for Mitch. And if we want Mitch to get kicked out, then we got to pony up too, for Jon Ossoff and for Raphael Warnock. Well, I do want to get Mitch beat. There's no question about that. I do. And why do I want to get Mitch beat? Because Mitch has exposed the whole thing. He said on the phone call to the Republicans, he said, our people are getting hammered in Georgia. We got to give them something. We got to give them something. So what happens if they do produce these particular stimulus checks? Then should we vote for their two senators in Georgia? The answer is no, because if we do, we'll never get any more stimulus checks from them. Their incentive to give us stimulus checks will be totally gone, and they'll control the Senate, and they can block all relief bills, all survivor bills from that point forward. So I did a short take on this today, and I commend it to you. Oh, I don't think I posted that short take yet. I was busy posting stuff on AOC and Nancy Pelosi and replacing Pelosi, and I put forward 2 more short takes on that today. One was not so short. I think it was 24 minutes or 25 minutes or something. But the other one was my shortest short take ever, 4 minutes and 42 seconds. I'm here to report. Okay, so you probably want to take a look at those. Anyway, going forward, let's look at some of the good stuff that's been appearing. Start off with a note from probably my favorite columnist at this point. Really savvy guy. Okay. I mean, I like a lot of people, but for a daily column, every single day, real savvy, nobody can beat Dave Dayen at this point in time. This is from December 17th, 2020. That's today. The tax time bomb that Congress can defuse. Where is there a tax time bomb? Well, turns out, of course, that unemployment insurance is taxable. It's taxable. So these unemployment plus-ups can get people into higher tax brackets and make the unemployment payments actually taxable. Okay, now, the stimulus checks are not taxable. Evidently, they don't add to income. But the unemployment benefits do. And the massive unemployment benefits, okay, that were delivered this year, about $130 billion through October, are all taxable. All of those taxes will be due at the federal level, and in 34 states that tax unemployment benefits, and the government will start asking for it in tax returns next year. So Dave says, and he's right, this is targeted anti-stimulus on precisely the people hit hardest by the pandemic economically. But Congress has an option in this relief package. It can make unemployment benefits during the pandemic non-taxable and prevent a snapback that will stunt economic recovery at the worst possible time in the early months of next year, before the vaccine take-up brings the economy back to life. The more you collected from unemployment without taking taxes, the more you'll owe after the fact. This means the most vulnerable people in America, the 3.94 million, have been out of work for over 6 months, have the most tax liability. The IRS does instruct people to withhold a portion of their unemployment insurance to avoid a tax time surprise, quote unquote, but almost nobody does that. Why? Because people in that position need all the money they can get every day. They can't afford to put any money aside. That's ridiculous and unrealistic. So, the point is, there's going to be a drain on the economy just when we can't afford to have a drain on the economy. And it's going to drag everybody down. Everybody down. So, this is something we have to worry about. Dave points it out, and he says, we have an austerity pull here. We have an austerity pull. And Congress ought to do something about it. So that's what I want to say about that particular piece. I'm going to move on a little bit to a very good post that appeared in Jacobin. Let me pull that up for you. This one is entitled Austerity Kills. Paygo Must Go. And it was written by Ari Robin Haft. Ari Robin hyphen Haft. H-A-V-T. And he says, for Republicans, austerity has long been part of their cynical political gamesmanship. I ought to give you the date of this. It is December 14th. Has long been part of their cynical political gamesmanship during Obama's presidency. Stimulus package that was intentionally downsized to minimize criticism from deficit hawks. In other words, pre-compromise, essentially giving up before you've even started to fight. That's what Obama did. Stimulus package intentionally downsized, kept to less than $1 trillion when he needed $1.8 trillion just so he could avoid criticism from the deficit hawks, was declared tyrannical and became the supposed raison d'etre of the Tea Party movement. I don't think that became the raison d'etre of the Tea Party movement. I think the raison d'etre of the Tea Party movement was actually the cave-in to Wall Street, not taxing back those Wall Street bonuses. That wasn't part of the stimulus package. That was different. Well, maybe it was part of the stimulus package. I forget exactly whether that was part of the stimulus package. All I know is Wall Street got pulled out. They got pulled out of the depression by the Fed largely, actually, in part by the Treasury. And then it wasn't so much that they got helped. It was that because they got help, these Wall Street people made these huge bonuses. And the Tea Party was triggered by this guy, I forget his name now. It was Rick something or other, on the floor of Wall Street, on the floor of the stock exchange. He gave a rant talking about how these guys were profiting from the bailout and the government was refusing to claw back these bonuses. And he went on a right-wing rant that was based on that. And that was the trigger event for the beginning of the Tea Party movement, which was astroturfed, actually, by the Koch brothers. That's my recollection of what happened in 2009, in the early days of the Obama period. But where the Tea Party movement really grew on was the healthcare reform movement. I remember that summer going to a town hall here in Northern Virginia, a town hall on the Affordable Care Act, when the public option was something that hadn't been killed by the Obama administration yet. And the radical rightist Tea Partiers were there. And they were ranting and raving against the Affordable Care Act. And ranting and raving against single payer. Because single payer was still an option among some of us at that time, even though the Obama administration had already taken it off the table in the first month. There were many of us who still were protesting and demonstrating for single payer. Anyway, They were going crazy. Okay, the deficit hawks were going crazy about that. The Tea Party movement, okay, was going crazy. But of course, okay, as Avi Robin Haft says, but of course, the Trump administration's profligate spending created no similar concerns. Of course, because the Tea Party movement is pretty well dead. We can now expect that at noon on January 20th, 2021, Republicans will suddenly rediscover their disdain for deficit spending. It's quite clear by now. They don't have a disdain for deficit spending. They have a disdain for Democrats spending on their constituencies. They don't mind at all when the Republicans spend on their constituencies. However, we can also expect some conservatives to take up the same mantle, demanding fiscal responsibility and the return of austerity politics. And who's already doing that? The people in the Problem Solvers Caucus. Joe Manchin and Mark Warner. And before too long, we're going to hear from Kyrsten Sinema. I'm certain we're going to hear from her. And we're lucky if we don't hear from John Hickenlooper and Michael Bennet. Anyway, they're going to be demanding fiscal responsibility and the return of austerity politics. Yes, they are. And the Fiscal Times is going to be getting in back of them and talking about how much we have to worry about the debt. In service of their cause, they will insist on the continued implementation of a rule in the House of Representatives known as PAYGO, which requires legislation to be funded by either tax increases or spending cuts. And I might add to that, in spite of the fact that we very well know that taxes do not fund spending, and we also know that spending cuts do not fund spending. The reserve balance in the Treasury spending account is always and everywhere filled up by the Federal Reserve in response to certain triggers. But it's the Federal Reserve and congressional appropriations together that are doing the funding. These triggers, tax increases, as a trigger, or bond sales as a trigger. Yeah, those are triggers. But there can be other triggers too. Like, for example, platinum coins, high-value platinum coins getting deposited at the Fed. And congressional mandates to the Fed to add to the reserves in the Treasury spending account. Those are two more triggers. They haven't been used yet, but they could be used. They could be used. They're perfectly within the law, perfectly constitutional. They could be used. So we don't have to trigger further additions to reserves in the Treasury spending account by tax increases or by spending cuts. We could use other triggers. During the 2018 midterm election, Nancy Pelosi pledged to restore the PAYGO rule in the House of Representatives, and she did that. She kept her promise and changed the rules when she assumed the speakership at the beginning of the next Congress. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and Ro Khanna voted against the entire rules package as a result of what she did. Her office claimed PAYGO was a statutory requirement based on an Obama-era provision, and that failing to establish their own rule would allow the Trump White House vast powers to cut the federal budget. This was ridiculous. One spokesperson said to CNN, "There's a PAYGO mechanism within the federal law that requires the Office of Management and Budget, which is led by Mulvaney, to offset the cost of deficit-increasing legislation by forcing indiscriminate, across-the-board cuts in federal mandatory spending. Its merits were dubious at the time, but with Joe Biden as president, this rationale will no longer be operative, in any sense. Are you sure, Avi Robin Haft? What if Neera Tanden gets to be in the OMB? What if she gets there? And she points out to Joe Biden, there is this pay-go mechanism within the federal law that requires me as the director of OMB to offset the cost of deficit-increasing legislation by forcing indiscriminate across-the-board cuts in federal mandatory spending. What if that happens? Better see to it that Neera Tanden isn't confirmed as the director of the OMB, because she might read the law differently than somebody else who wants to deficit spend. And yet, the most significant economic and health crisis in decades, it seems that the significant pressure needs to be put on Pelosi's office to eliminate pay-go. And the Economic Policy Institute has issued a paper entitled The Bad Economics, of pay-go. And there have been many attacks on pay-go over the years showing how ridiculous it is, including the fact, of course, that CBO can't reliably project whether something is going to be deficit neutral or not for 6 months out, much less project that reliably over 10 years. Pay-go is all based on a fiction that the CBO can tell us when something is going to be deficit neutral and when it is not. Quote, the recovery from the Great Recession was the slowest in post-World War history. It was. It was a failure. It was why Obama did not get a third term with Hillary Clinton winning in 2016, because nobody was excited over the economic performance of America. People in the Midwest were still in the tank from Obama's and Bush's and Clinton's trade policies, from the 40-year decline in prosperity that the working middle class in the Midwest had been suffering, such that they were no longer middle class. Just a little story for a minute or two. When I was in graduate school, at Michigan State, the family, of my first wife had a summer cottage, and it was on one of the Great Lakes. It was a family that had a double income. She was a school teacher. Her husband was a high-level custodian in the schools, in Detroit. So they were fairly solid. But there were many people around them who were people who had jobs. They were in the auto workers, and they had jobs with GM and Ford at the time. And they were making a living that was good enough to afford their regular home in New York. I'm sorry, not in New York, in Flint, or in Detroit, or in some other city, in Michigan. And they could afford a summer place on one of the Great Lakes. And they got good paid vacations and good benefits. And in the summer, they went up there and had a very nice time. And life was good for them. And they could send their kids to colleges, low-cost colleges in Michigan at that time. And life was much nicer than it was today. And then, of course, this was back in the 60s, in the early 60s. So then, of course, we started getting into times where the unions got weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker. And the median wage stopped going up. You all know the chart. It's not very much higher today than it was in the early 1970s. It stopped going up, while the median wage for every other part of the economy started jumping up. Now we have one of the highest rates of inequality within the developed world. In fact, there's a question now whether we even are in the developed world. But that's another debate. Anyway, the recovery from the Great Recession was the slowest in post-World War history, and the degree of fiscal austerity can entirely explain its slowness. It does. This slowness, induced by Obama, by the way, by his passing a stimulus bill of $800 billion when he needed one that was $1.8 trillion. And his people knew it. Christina Romer, on the Council of Economic Advisors at the time, was telling people on the White House staff, to be fair, I don't know if it ever got through to Obama or whether Larry Summers stopped it, but it was common knowledge among the staff that $1.8 trillion was her opinion about what was needed. And she was damn right. And he was worried about getting criticism from the deficit hawks. This slowness meant increased unemployment, increased hunger, decreases in access to health care, and an overall increase in mortality. Yes, austerity kills. You bet it does. So by design, PAYGO specifically constrains progressive policies, giving leadership in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, of course, an excuse for not bringing otherwise popular measures before Congress. She's been a drag. She was a drag in 2009 and 2010 when she had control of the House. She was a drag in 2007 and 2008 when she had control of the House. She was a drag in 2019 and 2020 when she was in control of the House. She screwed up the negotiations over the CARES Act. We're in trouble, the kind of trouble we are today, because she didn't ensure that relief under the CARES Act would remain in place for the duration of the crisis. She blew that particular negotiation while giving the big corporations all they wanted, removing all incentive for Mitch McConnell to come back to the table. And then when people discovered that, after the fact, she blustered her way. So you'll get plenty more assistance. There'll be great state and local. Don't worry, it's coming, it's coming. There'll be a second chance. There'll be a third chance. We saw all these chances. Every one of them went away. Now we have a final chance. Not because of anything Nancy Pelosi did. Not because of any negotiation she was a part of. But because Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, two people who shouldn't be anywhere near the Senate, are getting hammered in Georgia. And Mitch McConnell is afraid they won't win and he will lose control of the Senate. That's why we're getting another chance right now. And if they do win, if we let them win, if we don't beat them, there will be no more relief bills after that until the stock market is crashing and the Wall Streeters are crying out to Mitch to save them, to give them another money cannon, another $4.6 trillion money cannon to save them. Jeez. The entire purpose of the pay-go rule is purportedly to provide political cover to moderate Democrats in swing districts so they can claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility. Well, this has always been a silly argument. It is now political malpractice. If a Democratic public demands pay-go because they are scared of hypothetical Republicans complaining about budget deficits, they are so incompetent that the DCCC should recruit a new candidate to run in their district. They should, but they won't. They love those incompetent candidates. They love incompetent incumbents who did not know how to defend their seats in their own districts. They lost 10 seats in the previous election. For the Congressional Progressive Caucus, the pay-go rule should be viewed as a declaration of war against its agenda. A Green New Deal, Medicare for all, tuition-free college, and debt forgiveness would all be made less likely to succeed under this House rule. And how about housing relief? How about the right of people to have a roof over their heads? We need an expansive housing program. This is part of the Green New Deal, indeed. How are we going to get one if pay-go is involved? It's not only progressives and leftists who should be concerned. Biden is entering the White House at a time when a large stimulus package is necessary. His re-election, and by the way, the re-election of the House Democrats in 2022 is contingent on lifting the real economy, says Avi. He's quite right. And not simply Wall Street. Out of the malaise created by the COVID-19 pandemic, the White House is already going to have to contend with the Senate controlled by Mitch McConnell, maybe, hopefully not, who will be unlikely to want to provide any legislation that would increase Democratic prospects at the ballot box. With a thin majority, the midterm elections will already put control of the chamber in peril. The irony is that the members who will likely push for the pay-go rule, the moderates from swing districts, are the ones who will be put most at risk by its existence. Yeah, the pay-go rule is not going to threaten AOC or Rashida. They're still going to win in their district because they'll fight against pay-go. They'll fight for good things. It won't be their fault, okay, if pay-go continues. It won't be their fault if Democrats get beaten in 2022. More moderates from swing districts are going to be defeated. The worst political strategy Democrats could deploy over the next years would be to go small when it comes to domestic spending. No, they should be proposing big things and fighting for them every step of the way and running on them in 2022 if the Republicans don't give way. This is why the elimination of the pay-go rule is such an important test for Nancy Pelosi's speakership. We shouldn't let her have that test because the implementation of the pay-go rule in 2018 was her test, and she failed it. Including this at the beginning of this Congress is a sure sign, says Avi, that the House of Representatives is not ready to tackle the major issues of the day and would rather wrap itself in process issues. It would set an early tone that could bode poorly for the midterms in 2 years. More important would be its immediate impact. If the first act of Congress during the prelude to the Biden's presidency is to enact one of its guardrail policies, it will immediately signal the Democratic Congress is not ready to improve conditions for working people. Nope. Pelosi has never been ready to improve conditions for working people. That's a big failure. That's why she's such a slimeball. Actually, that's a consequence of her being such a slimeball. More on austerity. Here's something by Dave Sirota. It's long past time for Democrats to reject austerity. I got that up there? Yeah. I guess I got that up there. You can see it. Dave says, I think this was today, by the way. Yeah, 12/17/2020. At Jacobin. As Americans continue to starve, face evictions, and die during this week's congressional slowdown over desperately needed stimulus legislation. Actually, it's survival legislation. Former President Barack Obama weighed in by trying to erase the historical cautionary tale that already seems to be happening again. Looking back at the economic crisis during his first term, Obama told New York Magazine that he was, quote, full Keynesian at that time in terms of trying to get as much stimulus out the door as quickly as possible, unquote. What a lie. What a lie. There was a diary at Daily Kos today by D'Artagnan lying about this. We know Obama was not full Keynesian. What he was, get as much stimulus out the door as quickly as possible. He could have passed a $1.8 trillion bill. He had that kind of support in Congress. He had those kinds of big majorities in Congress. He could have passed as big a bill as he wanted, either by getting rid of the filibuster or by legislating but through reconciliation. He was not full Keynesian. The full Keynesian was Christina Romer, who wanted $1.8 trillion. His administration cut that off immediately at the pass. Full Keynesian, my foot. That's a barefaced lie. And D'Artagnan was writing a diary about what a decent and honest person Obama was. That's what got me so angry today. Obama was not a decent and honest person. He was a devious, dishonest person who lied quietly time and again throughout his whole administration. And he says his critics were wrong to assume that the Democratic Party, which had full control of Congress, backed a smaller than necessary stimulus bill based on some concerns about deficits at a time when that should have been the last thing we were worrying about. He says, at the end of the day, I had to get Ben Nelson's vote. I had to get Arlen Specter's vote. And I had to get Susan Collins' vote. Otherwise, I'm getting nothing. That's baloney sausage. That's baloney sausage. He only had to get 50 votes for the stimulus bill. if he passed it under reconciliation. He had lots of votes to give away. And that doesn't count Susan Collins' vote. Susan Collins was a Republican at the time. Arlen Specter was a Republican at the time. They were not votes Democrats were counting on. The only mention of a Democratic vote here is Ben Nelson's vote. Arlen Specter became a Democrat at a later time. Susan Collins is still a Republican. When Obama got into office, he had 58 Democrats in the Senate. You're telling me you can't end the filibuster with 58 votes in the Senate? You're telling me you can't get a reconciliation vote with 58 Democrats and total control of the House? These are lies. I'm making a decision to go ahead and take 3/4 of a loaf rather than have a lengthy fight for the whole loaf. Even if I win, could delay things significantly, hamper our ability to right the ship. That's such bullshit. I cannot believe it. He had the votes to ride roughshod over the Republicans. Roughshod. He could have passed that stimulus bill in 3 days if it had been set up right by Nancy Pelosi and by Harry Reid. They had the parliamentary smarts to do it. I can't even remember. That bill might have been passed under reconciliation. I don't actually remember at this point. But reconciliation would have been easy, nothing to do at that time. He could have made short shrift of a $1.8 trillion bill. Why did he not do it? He wouldn't do it because he was a deficit hawk himself. We know that because he established the Deficit Commission, other than the Cat Food Commission, in the first months of 2010. And thereafter, he tried to minimize the deficit throughout his whole presidency. That's why the recovery was the longest in history. Anyway, yeah, Obama was just being an apologist, just lying about his record, just trying to rewrite history. Obama and his party congratulated themselves for passing legislation that, in the name of reducing the deficit, rescinded the White House's authority to spend billions of dollars to help Americans being thrown out of their homes. That was called the Pay It Back Act. The Democratic bill reduced the size of TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, just after it bailed out the banks. But just before a new president might decide to use the money for what it was originally supposed to do, help the homeowners. He wouldn't help the homeowners. Now remember, Graham Elwood lost his house at that time. In part because of Obama's shenanigans. Sorry, shouldn't call them shenanigans. Obama's perfidy. Midst of all the pain and suffering during the financial meltdown, Politico reported in 2010 that, quote, the White House has signaled it wants to dedicate 2010 to deficit reduction and putting the bulk of TARP funds into paying down the debt could please budget hawks on the Hill, unquote. What about the budget hawk in the White House? That was the problem. The budget hawk in the White House. The budget hawks in the Hill were in the minority. David points out that congressional Democrats were patting themselves on the back for passing a bill to prevent the president from using money to help people. And Michael Bennet said, that's what people in my town hall meetings want, he insisted. They want to reduce the deficit. as foreclosures and budget cuts ravaged his state's economy. And Dave Sirota ought to know, because his state is Michael Bennett's state. He lives in Colorado. And foreclosures and budget cuts were ravaging the state's economy back then. Obama signed that bill into law as part of the Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation. Just after the White House launched a commission to slash Social Security in the middle of the Great Recession. That was the Fiscal Commission. He didn't actually launch the commission at the time that the FinReg Act passed. That was Dodd-Frank. Dodd-Frank passed in the fall. He launched the Fiscal Commission in January of 2010. I remember. And the first meeting of the commission was set to coincide with Peterson Foundation's Fiscal Summit on April 28th. Guess what also happened on April 28th? There was a fiscal teach-in, a counter conference held at George Washington University. It was called the Fiscal Sustainability Teach-In Counter Conference, if I recall correctly. And it was about real fiscal responsibility. And that conference was staffed by MMT economists. And it was put together in 3 weeks with very little money. But we got there. We held it. And the videos and the slides that we produced fueled further conferences and further growth of the MMT movement. Based on the proceedings people could see from that one-day conference. And we've been fighting Pete Peterson and the fiscal hawks ever since that time. Just a few months later, Democrats were, in Obama's own words, shellacked in the midterm elections. His administration then doubled down on austerity. By the way, it was worse than that. They got shellacked at the state level, in the state legislatures too, because it was all part of the Democratic Party, people being angry at the Democratic Party because of them being so slow in ending the recession. And because the health care bill that they passed in March of 2010 was a bust, the Democrats had nothing to run on in 2010, and the Tea Party swept the field in the House, at the state level, and cut into the margin of Democrats in the Senate as well. So the Democrats lost across the board. Instead of changing course, instead of recognizing the truth about what the failure was caused by, Obama's administration, as Dave Sirota says, then doubled down on austerity, quickly releasing a proposal for Social Security benefit cuts and pressing the Republican Congress to enact some of them, Social Security benefit cuts. Meanwhile, millions suffered through an economic recovery that was the slowest in World War II history, the EPI reported. The result was a popular backlash that ultimately created the conditions for the rise of Donald Trump. Sadly, this is all lost history, deliberately flushed down the memory hole in service of both helping Obama build his pristine media brand and pretending Democrats have not played a willful role in creating the destructive politics of austerity. What David Sirota is telling us today, and what I'm telling you today, is the story that Bernie Sanders would not tell in his 2 campaigns because he didn't want to run against Obama. He didn't want to educate against Obama. He paid the price for that. Because that's why, in the end, Obama was able to get all the moderates to come together. Because Obama's status was never hurt by a true account of his performance, piercing the mass media bubble. Because Bernie, who had the big bullhorn in 2016, shrunk from that fight. He also shrunk from the fight for MMT at that time. These things were costly, and costly to Bernie himself, because not only did he lose in 2016, but when he came back in 2020, the myths that came out of the Obama administration had never been debunked. And Obama was there to use his tremendous prestige to pull the moderate Democrats together and tank Bernie on Super Tuesday. As Bernie was not far away from locking up the nomination, if the other two would have stayed in the race, and Elizabeth Warren, the traitor progressive, if she had pulled out in favor of Bernie when it was already apparent at that time that she had no chance to win. No chance at all. In fact, if she'd been honest with herself, she would have known her only chance for the vice presidency was on Bernie's ticket. He was the only one who would have selected her to be vice president. And with no societal recollection of what happened during that time of the debacle, this same cycle is starting anew. And the broad strokes are eerily familiar. The only good thing is, if Biden goes through that whole thing, history is not going to be so kind to Biden. People won't be so shy about criticizing Biden. People won't be so shy about blaming him for the failure of the Democratic Party. He ought to remember that. A new administration entering office during an economic crisis that requires deficit spending. That's also a Republican Party that instantly transitions from spending on corporate bailouts to pretending it cares about debt. A Washington-anchored Democratic Party that fetishizes deficit reduction so that cable news pundits will portray them as sober-minded fiscal hawks rather than New Dealers. Wall Street executives and bondholders celebrate. Serfs outside the palace walls starve. A counter-revolutionary backlash follows, and the cycle starts anew. This is the austerity loop that seems to be starting over again, proving that when we forget our past, history may not exactly repeat itself, but it tends to rhyme. That is a brilliant passage by Dave Sirota. That is really good stuff, people. As in the 2008-2009 period, we face an unprecedented economic crisis, prompting Republicans to suddenly pretend to be fiscal conservatives and having these centrist Democrats like Mark Warner and Joe Manchin go along with that. Yeah, Mark Warner was on today criticizing Bernie Sanders for wanting both stimulus checks and unemployment insurance, pretending that there was a choice between the two that had to be made, not being honest enough to point out that there isn't any choice between the two. As Bernie pointed out in his MSNBC interview today, Democrats' stimulus talks tells a larger tale. after eagerly signing on to help Trump pass legislation creating a $500 billion corporate slush fund, the party led by golf-clapping master strategist Nancy Pelosi first drew up a potential $3.4 trillion economic rescue package and negotiated that down to $1.9 trillion as poverty and mass starvation skyrocketed. Her Democrats then rejected Trump's offer of $1.8 trillion and negotiated further down to $348 billion. Now Congress is down to a mere $188 billion in new proposed spending. Cue tweets of Pelosi putting on sunglasses. Vox reported that the bill released Monday did not include another round of 1,200 stimulus checks, a very popular provision that was left out to reduce the cost of the package. But hey, at least it included a massive bailout for profitable defense contractors. Late Wednesday, there was word there may be some direct stimulus aid included in the bill, but the checks would be smaller and paid for with more austerity, specifically by slashing unemployment benefits. Yep, that's exactly what happened. And a tweet by Adam Gentleson, who was an advisor to former Senate Democratic Majority Leader Harry Reid, quote, instead of anything resembling a pressure campaign on popular policies like the checks, they spent months signaling their willingness to climb down off key demands. It reminds me of what they did with the healthcare reform bill in 2009. They spent a whole year climbing down off their demands after unilaterally taking Medicare for all off the table. Bernie Sanders put it more bluntly, quote, what kind of negotiation is it when you go from $3.4 trillion to $188 billion in new money? He says that is not a negotiation, that is a collapse, unquote. Bernie's now getting the cold shoulder from the conservative Dems, and he has to work with freshman Republican Josh Hawley to push for more direct aid. His analysis is unnecessarily polite. The Vermont senator's own experience successfully fighting Democrats' past push to cut Social Security suggests this is not an inadvertent collapse, but instead a deliberate and sinister assertion of the party's austerity ideology that Obama pretended and still pretends doesn't exist. It is an ideology with the elite in mind. Democrats fear being tagged as spendthrifts by millionaire MSNBC hosts. They're afraid to call out GOP hypocrisy on spending, and they refuse to embrace the kind of Keynesianism that even Trump himself championed. Since the Clinton era, Democrats have been zealous followers of the austerity religion. Absolutely, folks, absolutely, since Clinton they have. And here's Biden. When he's sworn in as president, he could end this vicious austerity loop. He could follow through on his campaign promises for robust investments in infrastructure, in fighting climate change, and an expansion to Social Security, which would boost economists like Stephanie Kelton and others who have been working to try to break the vice grip that anti-deficit ideologues have maintained on American politics for decades. And by the way, what about Stephanie Kelton? She's not on the Council of Economic Advisors. She wasn't selected to chair the National Economics Council. She wasn't selected as a Treasury Secretary. Where is she in the Biden administration? Where is Randy Wray? Where is Warren Mosler? But while Biden did momentarily tout deficit spending at the very end of the campaign. Let's be honest. There are signs that when it comes to austerity politics, he remains much more focused on delivering on his promise to make sure that nothing will fundamentally change. Absolutely. He's been taking corporate money. He hasn't been aggressively campaigning for stimulus checks. He's been busy asking for 1 million corporate checks for his Zoom call inauguration. He'll be entering office just after Trump Treasury Secretary Mnuchin pulled a spiteful redux of Democrats' previous move on TAR by preemptively rescinding the executive branch's authority to deploy more resources to boost the economy. Handcuffed by a narrowly divided Senate, the new president could counter by using executive authority to cancel student debt and expand Medicare, both of which could inject billions of dollars into the economy. And yet he's already suggesting he's looking to avoid moves that might spark a legal clash over executive power. Instead, he recently said to civil rights leaders that, quote, executive authority that my progressive friends talk about is way beyond the bounds, unquote. He's ruled out pushing Medicare for all through a burgeoning healthcare emergency, even as new Congressional Budget Office report shows the program would save $650 billion every year. And by the way, folks, that's an underestimate. I keep telling you. And you really have to listen. Other nations that have gone to Medicare for all have cut their overall spending on medical care by 1/2 to 1/3. We now spend $3.8 trillion. Last time I checked, that was 6 months ago. Might be up to $4 trillion now due to COVID. 1/3 of $3.8 trillion. Last I checked is what? $1.333 trillion per year that would be saved, even if we take the 2/3 figure, which is a minimum saving. Canada, the nation most like us, spends 11% of its GDP on healthcare. We spend 18% on healthcare. If we cut it down to 12%, that's where the $1.33 trillion comes from. This $650 billion estimate, that's something worked up from looking at each and every program and estimating what it would cost. All those estimates are conservative. They're deliberately conservative. Each component is conservative. When you add it all up, the final estimate is conservative. It doesn't accord with past empirical experience in other nations, and in the nation most like us, which is Canada. This underestimates the savings we're going to have by 50%. We're going to save, if we got this, we would save $13 trillion on healthcare spending over 10 years. As for appointments, Biden's economic team includes nominees with a long record of pushing austerity. There is Treasury Secretary Yellen, who has at times supported some necessary deficit spending and financial regulation, but who previously pushed spending cuts, called the debt unsustainable, and co-authored an op-ed calling for adjustments in both spending and revenue for Social Security. She did that, but I think she's going to be much more progressive this time. I believe. She has that in her makeup too. She's schizophrenic a bit. But I think the times will call forth her willingness to recognize a progressive need to spend what is necessary. I expect her to be the progressive economist in this particular administration. I think she'll be reinforced somewhat, by Jared Bernstein, and maybe some others. But I think she's going to be the leader that way, but it remains to be seen. There is Biden's choice to chair the White House Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, who pushed spending cuts and balanced budgets in 2012. Yes, she did. I haven't been too enthusiastic about her. That was an identity politics choice, I think, on Biden's part. Okay. And Heather Bushey, I've never trusted her progressivism either. But anyway, going further. There's BlackRock executive Brian Deese. Yeah, I don't think he's going to be very progressive. There's Neera Tanden, who touted Social Security checks. And there's Wally Wallaway, I guess his name is. He's also from BlackRock. He's going to be Yellen's assistant, at Treasury. He's going to push the other way. For decades, Biden's been one of the Democrats' most ardent proponents of austerity politics, to the point where he gave speeches on the Senate floor bragging about his work with Republicans to try to cut Social Security, which he tried to cut, by the way, on 6 different occasions. This record was scrutinized during the Democratic primary. We were all aware of it. We all knew it. He was set to give the top White House job to Bruce Reed, the executive director of Obama's commission to cut Social Security. But there was such an outcry over that he backed off, of Bruce Reed. And is content to have Neera Tanden at OMB. After that, he was considering Bruce Reed for OMB, but he thought maybe that was a bridge too far, too. So he settled on Neera Tanden and a personal insult to Bernie Sanders. So that was a personal insult, of course, to Bernie Sanders. Anyway, you are getting the picture from this article, by Dave Sirota. So, I think that I've given you the picture here. Basically, Dave finishes up this article by saying the austerity loop has to be broken. Whether or not it will remains the open question. I think if it's not broken, it's questionable whether our country and whether the human race will survive, because we need to get at handling the climate emergency immediately. Dave calls for all of us to recognize the austerity loop for what it really is, just another scheme that perpetuates an untenable status quo. So that's it for that one. I want to finish up with an article from Bernie's, one of Bernie's former chief advisors and the 2016 campaign manager, if I recall correctly, Jeff Weaver, who has had something of a questionable record himself. I picked this up in Reader's Supported News. It was supposed to be, a Jacobin, but I didn't find it there. Anyway, he says, let me share this with you also. Thank you for hanging in there, folks. I hope you've been sharing. I haven't been getting too much in sharing lately. While the curtain falls on Donald Trump's desperate and frivolous post-election lawsuits. Oh, by the way, I'm simultaneously streaming tonight, both to Facebook and to YouTube. So for those watching me on YouTube, hello. While the curtain falls on Donald Trump's desperate and frivolous post-election lawsuits, Dems are rightly asking how they were able to beat Trump but could not regain control of the Senate and maintain or increase their margin in the House. And he goes through the centrist arguments, that we've talked about. People were turned off by defund the police and socialism and other BS arguments. He says, on its face, that story is incongruous. In fact, it is so nonsensical that one of the standard bearers of, quote, the left dragged us all down crowd, former CIA officer and Blue Dog Coalition representative Abigail Spanberger, actually won a higher percentage of the vote in 2020 than she did in 2018. That's true, but she didn't win a much higher percentage. She squeaked by in 2018, and she kind of squeaked by again. A swing of 2 points would have beaten her even this time. So what's really going on? Asked Jeff. Much of the answer lies in the very strategy chosen to beat Biden and oust Trump. In 2020, Democrats did not focus on winning back working-class voters in the 200-plus counties that shifted from Barack Obama to Trump 4 years ago. And then they won back only a tiny fraction of those locales. Instead, what Democrats did was to adopt a strategy aimed at replacing the blue-collar segment of the Obama coalition with suburban voters and anti-Trump Republicans, which succeeded at the top of the ticket but created the weakest Democratic coattails in 6 decades. Tens of millions of dollars was spent by Democratic groups to turn out Republicans who could no longer stomach Trump. Coupled with a surprisingly effective turnout operation by the GOP machine, 15 million more Republicans voted in 2020 than in 2016, while Democratic turnout only increased by 6 million votes. In other words, the Republican voter suppression operation was probably quite successful, even though the Democrats won the presidency. If 15 million more Republicans voted in 2020 and only 6 million more Democrats, that's a problem. It's difficult to know how effective Democrats' focus on swinging GOP voters was, given that Trump consolidated the Republican vote percentage-wise from 2016-2020, going from 90% support to 94% support among the GOP voters for Trump. That said, an analysis of 2016 and 2020 exit polls shows Biden did get almost 100,000 more Republican votes than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, because the overall size of the electoral pie was much bigger. It is an open question whether those Republican votes would have come to Biden without the enormous cost of Republican outreach by pro-Biden groups. Trump may have made himself so toxic those voters would have gone to Biden anyway. And there is evidence that some of the strategies to court the GOP voters were ineffective. So what was it due to? Why did Biden win? He won because of young voters. Young voters. Why were Democrats successful in Georgia, not in Iowa, North Carolina, asks Jeff Weaver. Even in face of a shift, albeit a marginal one, in the Republicans' favor in the Peach State. Numbers are clear. Georgia went blue to the overwhelming turnout among young voters. Nationally, young voters were 17% of the electorate, and they voted overwhelmingly for Biden. And by the way, they would have done that for Sanders too, even in greater numbers. In Georgia, young voters were 20% of the electorate, and they supported Biden by 13 points over Trump. And to put this another way, Biden won the under 30 vote in Georgia by more than 129,000 votes. That's more than 10 times his winning margin of 12,640 votes across the entire state. If young voters in Georgia were the same percentage of the electorate as they were nationally, Biden would have received 19,500 fewer votes in Georgia, and he would have lost. In Iowa and North Carolina, young voters were only 16% and 15% of the electorate, respectively. One could only imagine the impact if the king's ransom spent to woo Republicans and instead been focused on progressive youth. Young voters are not the future of the Democratic Party, says Jeff Weaver. They are our present. The critical importance of young voters in turning red states to blue should have already been learned. In 2008, youth turnout was the highest since 1972. Obama won both Indiana and North Carolina, but he only carried the 18-29 to 29 age demographic in each. For the record, the only age cohort Biden carried in his Arizona win was also voters under 30. But it's a lesson that keeps being forgotten as party leaders and electeds overreact to Republican name-calling. And he continues, the Republicans are always going to attack. That's the nature of politics. The panic over defunded police and socialism among centrists is really no different than when so many Democrats retreated from a fair estate tax because Republicans yelled death tax. The political contexts are called campaigns for a reason. Like a military campaign, your enemy gets to shoot back. That's not cause to cower in your foxhole. It's a cause to deliver more intense and overwhelming fire in response. I got to agree with Jeff Weaver for all his faults. He's completely right there. There's the whole story of how the liberals lost their name and their status and their reputation during the late 1960s and the 1970s because they did not effectively return fire against the Republicans, but retreated from the liberal label and started calling themselves progressives instead. I mean, the liberal brand in the 1960s was a noble and very successful brand. Very successful. All that was lost during the 1960s when people refused, during the 1970s, when people refused to fight back. Democrats should be mindful, says Jeff, that the referendum to raise the minimum wage got 61% of the vote in Florida, while Democrats were going down to defeat. The point moving forward, however, is simple. As attention focuses on Georgia and inevitably turns to 2022 midterms, attempting to rely on anti-Trump Republicans with Trump out of office is a loser, especially in down-ballot races. Anti-Trump Republicans without Trump are, well, just Republicans. But young voters will still be there, waiting to be inspired with bold policies that will ensure broad-based prosperity, opportunity, and inclusion. So will blue-collar voters, including the Black and Latino men that Democrats lost ground with this cycle. If hand-wringing centrists win the day, Democrats can expect losses in Georgia and a tough cycle in 2022. Tough schmuff, they're going to be slaughtered in 2022 like they were in 2010. If Democrats learn the real lessons of 2020, we can build the type of electoral coalition that has shown its unique power in turning red states blue. In case the point is lost on anyone, if Democrats want to win in Georgia and the midterms, they must appeal to the most progressive part of our party, young people, not Republicans. And Jeff Weaver is right. Okay, I couldn't agree more. The only thing I would add is, if Democrats embrace centrism now and over the next 2 years and get whacked upside the head in the elections of 2022, as will then surely happen, the end result is going to be that the People's Party, the new party, is going to eat their lunch. In the millions, people are going to run away from them and flock to the new party. And by 2023, the Democratic Party will be a rump political party in the United States. And if that happens, they will deserve every bit of what they get for not getting out of the austerity loop right now. That's all I have to say today. I will now start going through your comments. Catherine Tokarska said at 9:10, at least your Facebook comments, those are the only ones I can see right now. She says, I have a question, though I may not be here to hear the answer. We'll check back. Got a client call. Why do you think the credit card delinquencies are at such historically low levels? If they are, it's probably because of forbearance by the banks, because the banks probably want to play extend and pretend. They probably want to avoid clamping down on their customers, because then they'd have to declare bad debts and it would have an impact on their balance sheets. They don't want to write down those debts right now, or they themselves might well be in trouble. So that is my theory of why the delinquencies are low. I haven't looked at this in detail, so I might not be right. But if I were in their place, I'd go easy right now, because people are really, really having a tough time. And those loans, remember, those loans, those are assets for the banks. The deposits are liabilities, but the loans are assets. If they liquidate those loans, they lose much of their value. If they declare delinquencies and then are faced with settlements, their asset values go. Not good for the banks. Case says shared. And Joe Gomes says, it's nothing but a face-saving farce. Steve Wolfbrand says, me too. Catherine Tokarska says, follow up on first question and debt going down. And she leaves a link to the Fed. I'll have to look at the link after the show is over. And Joe Gomes says, most people use government relief to pay off debt. That's old data. Well, that's, I'm sure in part, an interesting theory. I don't know if most people did that. There were many people who didn't have the freedom to do that. They just had to spend that money, not use it to pay off old debt. Not only that, even if they use it to pay off old debt at that point and to stay in the game, those credit cards are about to come home to roost again, because the government support is very, very weak now. Steve Wolfbrand says, I'm saving cash as much as I can. Hard times ahead. Catherine said, that seems quite high to just be the COVID relief, which we are told is inadequate. Well, the original COVID relief for those first 4 months, that was good relief. People getting $600 a week as a plus up, plus but the original $300 a week or so, they were getting over $900 a week, which in some cases was more than what they were making. So they were able to use that to pay down some debt. Catherine says, That's agreed, except for me, because I make money when the economy is poor. Don't get me wrong. I still vote for the good of the group, not for my own financial gains. Kay says, don't get me started on F and Romney. Catherine Tokarska says, I also posted a poll in a student loan debt group with over 12K members asking if you were more than 60 days behind on housing costs. Almost everyone said they were current. Some noted they were living with rent free. But that's interesting. But of course, we know from statistics that there are many people who are more than 60 days behind on their rent, and that they're continuing to live in their homes only because there's been a moratorium on eviction. There are plentiful statistics on that. And Joe Gomes says the Republicans beat Democrats from the left all the time, which is right. And Kay says Bernie did a town hall from Georgia earlier. He's campaigning for the Georgia Senate candidates. If the Democrats win in Georgia, guess who becomes the chair of the Budget Committee in the Senate? A very powerful position. Bernie effing Sanders does. Steve Wolfbrand says, if you keep posting more shortcakes, you could get a job at IHOP. Very cute, Steve. Catherine Tokarska says, but there's another reason I expect some bankruptcy filings to come from that. They can't afford to pay income taxes on the unemployment. The debt becomes dischargeable over time. Several criteria must be met. In 3 years' time, I expect to see some of this debt coming up along with other debts, I'm sure. Carmen says people need every cent. Good point. Paying the income tax is a drain if you can scrape the money to actually pay it when it comes due in April. And Kay says Reverend William J. Barber II did a Zoom call today with 10 others with some of the Biden folks today. Very good. Carmen says, how's your fur baby coming? Fur baby? Catherine says, wonder what the sales will be reported as for holiday purchases. Saw some empty shelves for holiday cards. I don't know. I guess we have to wait and see what the sales are. I sort of been hearing rumblings that the retail sector is suffering and people need a lot more money for retail shopping around Christmas time. Catherine Tokarska says, but Carmen Muniz, same, good day today. I think she'll be around for a while. It is hard to tell with liver disease. It's one day up and one day down. And L. Stephen Day says, Rick Santorum? ? Now, what about Rick Santorum? Carmen says, that's good news. Kay says, they all need to go. Steve Day says, no pay go. Am I going crazy? Where are the thumbs up and other buttons so I can react to what Joe is saying? I don't know. I don't know where those buttons are. I can't imagine where the buttons are. I don't actually have my Facebook open right now. Okay, it's too much of a drag of a flow, and since I'm simultaneously streaming to both places, I didn't want to put a burden on this. Steve Day says the 117th, I think that's the number of the Congress. And Carmen says, Catherine Tokarska, we're listening intensely. Steve Day says, stroke the comment box for smiles. Kay says, okay, another screw up by Pegosi and Obama. Catherine Tokarska says, yes. Uncle Sam does not take out a credit card, old bummer. And Catherine Tokarska says, 10K years ago. Ha. Catherine Tokarska says, I have a summer place. It's called filling up the tank with gas and moving my house on wheels to someplace in the summer. Kay says, my dad was a steelworkers union. My parents had a summer cottage, Kay, at a local lake too. Yeah. We took weeks-long vacations back then, too. Yeah, life was good back then, wasn't it? When the unions were strong, life was good. Carmen says, before neoliberal enslavement. Kay says, Obama started the fall of our family biz, too, back there in southeast North Carolina. Shake my head. Steve Day says, austerity is murder. Yes, austerity kills. Austerity is murder. Austerity sucks. A number of good hashtags. Catherine Tokarska says, uh, okay, but she says, apparently, it's hard to represent the people and keep up your multimillionaire status. Those fancy fridges aren't going to fill themselves with exotic ice creams. Carmen says, here, here. Catherine says, the upside to no relief is people will not stay quiet. Kay says, yes, Carmen, was a whole different country back then. Carmen says, sounds nice. Catherine says, I love it when rich people tell me we're out of money. Yeah, I know. Yeah, Mark Warner, the $90 million man, is telling people we're out of money. Kay says, was a great place for me to grow up for sure. Happiest time of my life, Catherine says. I try to always say cancellation of student loan debt, not forgiveness. Forgiveness implies we did something wrong. Yes, Catherine, I agree. Cancellation of student loan debt. Kay says, the country has been going to shit my whole adult life. Yeah, pretty much mine too. Certainly, since the 1980s, it's been going to shit. The 1970s weren't very good either. Carmen says, time for the squad to sell the possible dream. No half-stepping. Steve Day says, let's work on fixing that. Learn MMT, hashtag learn MMT. And he gives a YouTube link. Carmen says, L. Steve Day of Preaching to the Choir. And L. Stephen Day says, so we're just giving Joseph company, Carmen. Carmen says, L. Stephen Day, oh, sorry, thought you were just replying to an MMTer. And Kay says, I already did that, Steve Day. Yeah, I'm the MMTer. Steve Day says, it always looks to me like no one is listening and building on what Joseph is covering. Chatter, 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 chatter. And he smiles. Steve Day says, fine. Kay says, Obama is from Chicago, corrupt as Dems come. Steve Day says, I already knew that. Chicago's so-called Dem mayor now is a corrupt Dem from Ohio. Go figure, shake my head. Kay says, I learned to hate Obama. And Steve Wolfbrand says, truth, Doc, preach it. Carmen Muna says, Warren thought HRC would make her VP. I know. Then she thought Biden would make her VP. Catherine Tokarska says that's not her role. She gives good talks, sweet talk into Democrat voters' ears. Yes, Steve Wolfbrand, hope and change. Warren like a barking dog, but when it comes to defending the homestead, she runs and hides. And Claudette says, neolibs, and there are many. Steve Wolfbrand says, fuck Sirota, I'm with Jimmy Dore all the way. You should be with me all the way, Steve. I'm the one who's not screwing around with Medicare for all and some other minor concessions. I want to get rid of Fancy Nancy right now. And then I want to negotiate and get concessions from her speaker who needs squad votes in order to get into the speakership. That's what needs to be done. Steve Wolfbrand, are you ever on Twitter? Go on Twitter. Hashtag replace Pelosi. Look for that hashtag. It's been going on for a week now. I forget 3 or 4 videos on it already. Kay says, Steve, I had hope, but there was no change at all. Catherine Tokarska says, I was quite upset to find out she got Perk's Indian ancestry beating out other minorities. Steve says, me too. All of us. By the way, to be fair, I do think that she believed that. The reason why I think she did is why else would she go and take a test? Why else would she go and take a test? She thought that would shut up the Donald. It wouldn't have shut him up. He just would have said that the test had been falsified. That's all. But she took that test and she made the results public. So, Kay says, we live and hopefully learn a little. Evelina says, Catherine Tokarska, still we get the first Native American into Interior. I'm glad about that. Yes, I'm glad about that too. Not only she's a Native American, okay, she was pretty close to the squad. She never joined. But she was a pretty reliable vote to support initiatives for the squad. So Deb Haaland is pretty lefty. She was certainly on the left side of the Progressive Caucus, clearly there. Kay says, sorry she had to come out of Congress, though. I was sorry about that, too. And Evelina says, yeah, oh well. Catherine says, hells no, Kelton isn't getting there. That would pull back the curtain at the end of the yellow brick road. You bet, Catherine. Kay says, she was good. We need those like her in Congress. Kay says, I really have little hope for Biden. We all have to have little hope, but we all have to fight hard anyway. Fight like your lives depend on it, because they probably do. If we had Medicare for all, then Medicaid could go. Yeah, there would be no Medicaid. Especially if we had H.R. 1384, there would be no Medicaid. Kay says, still no answers in my Medicaid. Over a week later, shake my head. Carmen says, well, if she's totally over menopause, she may no longer have schizophrenic tendencies. Not sure who you're talking about there. Anyway, Kay says, it's a broken system just like Medicare has become. Wasn't like this when my parents got on it in the mid-60s. I haven't found that Medicare is broken. Of course, I do have a supplemental from Kaiser. So between the two, they're not broken. Even when it says, okay, Little Hope is okay, I think inspiring of himself, some things will align, like Dr. Joe said, the time will call forth some serendipity magic. On the part of some people, like I think there might be serendipity magic between Janet Yellen and Jay Powell. That might work. That might work. And that might produce some things through using the power of the Fed in spite of Biden. Kay says, I'd love to be pleasantly surprised, but not holding my breath. And Dolores Pierce says, Facebook, has limited my sharing. Thank you, Dolores, for trying. Kay says, Biden has to fire Social Security heads right away or there will be no changes. I know. Kay says, I hope Alex Lawson can get into school him soon. He'll never talk to Alex Lawson. He'll never talk to Alex Lawson, I don't think. I think Alex is too tough for him. He'll never forget what Alex did to Alan Simpson when Alex interviewed Alan Simpson as he was coming out of the cat food commission room, either coming out of it or going into it. I forget. It was one of the two. And he got some priceless quotes from Alan Simpson that really immediately blackened the name of the commission. It was all downhill from there. I'm sure the Obama administration never forgave him, and I'm sure Joe Biden bears a grudge. Carmen says Biden won because of COVID, dereliction on the part of Trump. Yeah, I think he did. I think that's why he did. If Trump had controlled the virus extremely vigorously and continued on the path he was on, the economic record probably would have looked pretty good by 2020, even though Trump wasn't really the cause of it looking good. He would have been credited, and he probably would have gotten in again without even pulling all the shenanigans he did pull, which, of course, he always has to do because he's inveterately a liar and a cheater. And Evelina says, you're too kind. He won because he cheated Bernie. That, too. And Case says, we need Bernie so bad right now. He does the best he can from the Senate, though. He does, and he's managed to do a few good things, and will manage to do a lot more good things from his perch in the Senate if he becomes the chairperson of the Budget Committee once again. Kay says, donate to Nina if you can. We need her badly. We certainly do. Catherine says, I was wondering if those delinquency rates are real. How can we verify? Who's putting out those rates? Which organization or federal agency, is putting them out? Catherine says, those are the BK filings, just so you know, or 30% down year to year. Catherine says, don't they have to charge off after X days, 90 or 180, something like that? Yeah, they probably do, but it's, I don't know whether, it's 180. Also, I don't know whether their charge-offs have been that duty. I don't know whether that duty remains in force for the duration of the pandemic. That might also be something that was suspended during the pandemic. Kay says, who can afford credit cards at 24% interest? Thankfully, I was able to pay mine off. Catherine says, it's true. I know some homeless people claimed unemployment, stating they collect recyclables, and since recycle plants are closed, they're out of work. For those homeless people, the $600 a week was manna from heaven. Kay says, too many homeless in this country. L. Steve Day says, thanks, Joseph. Good night, all. Catherine Tokarska says, Firestone all the way. Thank you, Catherine. And Kay says, I was so depressed when Rump got elected. I already knew how corrupt he is. And Catherine says, the link I sent you was from Fred in St. Louis. Then you're not going to get a more reliable link, than that. At least not in the immediate the future, Catherine. So good night, all. I think that brings us to an end. Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying. Thanks for participating. I will see you on Saturday. Remember, I do not live stream on Friday. I'll be posting some videos tomorrow, though. Most probably at least one, and maybe two. I have two I can post. I just don't know if I'll save the other one. And I may be doing one or two more before the week is out. I have the subjects, in hand. Kay thanks me for another great discussion. And Rebecca says, thank you, Joe. I'll be in touch. Thank you, Rebecca. And Evelina says, thank you, Dr. Joe. Thank you for coming, Evelina. It's always great to see you. Night all. See you on Saturday.